Now that I've cut the plywood for the shelves, I'm going to finish the top surface with several coats of water-based polyurethane. First, I'm going to sand the wood to give it a smooth surface. I'll start with 100 grit, then use 150 grit, and finish with 220 grit sandpaper. Sanding creates a lot of wood dust, so it's highly recommended that you wear a breathing mask while sanding to avoid breathing the dust in. Hold the palm sander firmly and apply a slight downward force as you move it over the entire surface of the material. You can use a methodical back and forth and up and down motion to ensure you get complete and consistent coverage. Now that we've finished sanding the wood, it's time to apply several coats of polyurethane. I'm going to use a high-gloss water-based polyurethane, which is practically odor-free and is easy to clean up with afterwards. Using a synthetic bristle brush is a recommended way to apply it to the wood surface. First, make sure the wood is clean and free of any dust from the prior sanding. Brush off the larger dust particles and then wipe down the surface with a dry cloth. Stir the polyurethane, never shake it or else bubbles will form and this could spoil your finish. There are some things to keep in mind when applying the polyurethane. Try to avoid wiping the brush against the edge of the can, since this can introduce bubbles into the mix. Also, use slow and even strokes with the brush, and minimize the number of times you retouch an area once it's been covered and has started to dry. Take your time and work in a methodical way, covering the entire surface from one side to the next. Remember, it's important to get a nice, even coat. Allow the polyurethane to dry according to the manufacturer's instructions, which can be up to 4 hours for the water-based solution. Now, when you feel the surface after this first coat, it's going to feel very rough. Worse than before you even did any sanding at all. Now there's a reason for this. The water in the polyurethane has raised the grain in the wood. So all these tiny pieces of wood in the surface have absorbed the water, and as they've dried, they've curled up, making the surface feel very rough. Now don't worry about this, it's very natural for wood to react this way. All you need to do is use a very fine grit sandpaper and gently sand down the grain until it's smooth again. Now don't sand right through the entire layer of polyurethane, otherwise you're back to square one. All you want to do is smooth it down again before continuing with the next coat of polyurethane. Make sure to wipe off any dust from the sanding. Now, we repeat the process. Stir your polyurethane, then apply a full coat using slow and even strokes with your brush. Allow it to dry completely, and you should find that this coat feels better than the last one. It will still feel a bit rough, and you'll again have to smooth it out with a fine grit sanding. Now the rest of the polyurethane application is repetitive, so I won't show you each subsequent coating because it's the same as what you've already seen. You will notice as you progress, however, that the surface does begin to pick up the glossy look that's closer to the finished product we're aiming for. I recommend you get at least 4 coats of polyurethane on your shelves. It may seem like a tedious task, but trust me, it's worth the effort. Now once you've finished your coats of polyurethane, you'll notice that there's a nice, fairly substantial layer protecting the wood. You may also notice, however, that it's not perfectly smooth. There may be some ridges left over from the brush. We're going to get rid of these using a technique that's called wet sanding. For this, you'll need to use some wet dry sandpaper in the 600 grit range and also in the 1000 grit range. This wet sanding technique does get a little messy, and there'll be some pasty water that falls onto the floor. So use a drop cloth or work in an area that will be easy to clean. I'm using a spray bottle to cover the layer of polyurethane with some water. I'm also dipping a rubber sanding block in a container of water. Now, I'm going to begin sanding the wet surface the same way I would normally. I'll use the spray bottle to keep the surface wet and the sanding block sliding easily. I'll occasionally also clean off the sanding block by rinsing it out. Now let me explain what's going on here. Sandpaper is basically paper with abrasive particles glued to it. As you do your sanding, however, bits of material get clogged in between the abrasive particles, reducing its sanding ability. What the water does in wet sanding is flush away the material, keeping the sandpaper clean and allowing it to be far more effective in sanding the material. You'll have to use sandpaper that's rated for wet-dry use, and a sanding block that's made of rubber, since a metal one will likely start to rust. After giving the surface a good sanding with the 600 grit sandpaper, clean off the residue to get a good look at the progress. It's helpful to view it at almost surface level to see where any ridges remain. Next, do the same wet sanding technique using the 1000 grit sandpaper. By the time you're finished this step, you should have an extremely flat and smooth surface. Now that the shelves are smooth, here's a trick to give them a mirror-like finish. I'm going to use a product called Finesse-it, which is actually a car polish. It's applied to the surface of your shelves in the same way that you'd apply it to the surface of a car. Use a small amount and spread it evenly over the entire shelf. Next, I'm going to use a buffing wheel to remove the dried polish. Any buffing tool that you have will do the job. Here's a look at a before and after picture of the finish. With just the polyurethane, there's a good gloss surface, but it's only after the wet sanding and polishing that it becomes more of a mirror-like finish. So we've cut the plywood for our shelves and finished the top surface with polyurethane. Now we'll start working on the metal edging that's going around it.